Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we are going to be returning to our Silmarillion Summarized series, and we're going to be talking about Chapter 3. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the Librarian, and now that Rings of Power Season 2 has wrapped up and ended, we can finally return to our regularly scheduled programming, and we can talk about the Silmarillion again and continue with our series summarizing the Silmarillion. Today we are picking up in Chapter 3. This is Of the Coming of the Elves and the Captivity of Morgoth. And this chapter, it's a bit of a doozy a lot of times for people as they come up on it. I know it was for me the first time I read it, and it's okay if it is for you too, because like a lot of these early chapters in the Silmarillion, it's not very long at all, but it is packed full of new information, a lot of new ideas, and there isn't a lot of narrative structure to it. It's more kind of laying the groundwork for what's going to come after it. So if this chapter messes you up, don't worry. Just take a step back, watch this video, kind of get a handle for what's going on, and if you need to skip reading this chapter, just do. You can move on to Chapter 4, which is only like a page and a half long, so it's not all that intimidating. But let's get going with Chapter 3. Now we're going to, just like we've been doing, we're going to break it down by talking about the vocabulary, the major characters, the major events, and the major themes that are going on. So first let's start with vocabulary. And boy, this chapter is heavy on vocabulary. This is probably the thing that messes up the most people when they come to read the Silmarillion. They get here to Chapter 3 and it is so vocabulary heavy, particularly in talking about all of the different kinds of elves. And you're like, whoa, let's just step back and maybe not read this anymore. Let's just go back to the Lord of the Rings where there were just elves. Now the truth is that there weren't just elves in the Lord of the Rings, but it's not so explicit about the different kinds of elves that are there. It's just kind of hinted at. In this chapter, it all gets laid out, but it doesn't get laid out in the clearest manner, and a lot of the things that it talks about just aren't that important to you as you're reading the story. So let me just clarify some of this. We're going to start with an easy vocabulary word, though, that comes up really early in the chapter, and that is Balrog. The Balrog, you will know if you've read The Lord of the Rings because you've seen one of them. But there are going to be a bunch of Balrogs in the Silmarillion, and they show up in this chapter as some of Melkor's primary servants. So we've got the Balrogs, and the only thing you really need to know about them is that they are demons of fire and shadow that serve Melkor. That's it. They're going to come up from time to time throughout the story, and just know they're like his heavy hitters. They're his tanks. Then there are some geography things here, and I don't want you to focus in on them a ton, but a couple of them are important, even if you don't understand exactly where they are on the map. Remember, the map of Middle-earth is going to change a few times throughout history. Pretty much anytime an age ends or anytime there's a big fight between good and evil, there's going to be some changing to the map. So you don't really need to understand exactly where these things are, but it is helpful if when you see the word come up, you know what it is. So the first one is Utumno. Utumno is Melkor's big fortress. It's in the north of Middle-earth, and he hides out there. The next word is Angband, and Angband is kind of his summer home, let's say. It's his home on the shores of Middle-earth, and he doesn't really live there, but he lets Sauron kind of run it. So that's where Sauron's hanging out, is Angband. And Angband and Utumno will both come up, so I just want you to kind of know what they are, even if you don't understand exactly what the difference is between them or where they are located on the map. Okay, now we're going to get into a few of the words about the elves. And again, we're not going to go into all of them because not all of them are important to your understanding of the story your first time through. But a few of them are, and they come up a lot, so I just want you to kind of be familiar with them. But if they're confusing you, don't worry, you can continue to read the story even if it's not all making sense right now. The first word is Quendi. So the Quendi are the elves. That's what they call themselves. That one's pretty simple. And you're going to see this word Quendi show up a whole bunch as a root in other words that refer to the elves. Then we have Cuvianin. Cuvianin is the place where the elves wake up. So of course, this chapter is really descriptive of what happens in it, right in the chapter title, and that is that the elves are coming and Melkor is going to be captured. So the elves are coming, and Cuvianin is just the place where they wake up. And it's kind of going to be their first home in Middle-earth, but once they leave it, they're not ever going to be able to get back there again. So Cuvianin, it kind of has this mystic quality to it as where the elves woke up, but where the elves can never return to. Next, we have another name for the elves, and this is the Eldar. Now the Eldar is just the name that Orome gives to the elves. And now let's get into a little bit of the names of the different kinds of elves. First, we have the Calaquendi. Now, we haven't talked about all of the major events that have happened yet. We're going to do that a little later on in this episode. But just know that there is a movement of the elves from Middle-earth over to Valinor. And a lot of these different kinds of elves have to do with that journey. So first we have the Calaquendi. Calaquendi is kind of a broad group. It is the elves of the light. So these are the elves that make it to Valinor and see the light of the trees. Remember the trees that we've talked about before? It's a big deal if you're an elf who's seen the light of the trees. So there's a special name for that, and that is the Calaquendi. Now, in contrast to that is the Moraquendi. The Moraquendi are the elves of the dark, or the dark elves. Although the term dark elves will also get used in a little bit different way later on, so it can be a little bit confusing. But the Moraquendi are basically just the elves that never went or never made it to Valinor, so they never saw the light of the trees. Really, the light of the trees is the distinguishing factor here. And you need to just kind of understand both of those words, Calaquendi and Moraquendi, together. Then we get a few more designations of elves. I know it's a lot, and we're not even going to go into all of them. But next we have 3 groups of elves, and these 3 groups of elves are going to be based, once again, on their journey over into the west, or over to Valinor. And specifically, they're going to be kind of grouped around leaders and also what they do if and when they get to Valinor. So first we have the Vanyar, and the Vanyar you don't really have to worry about. They don't play any major role in the story of the Silmarillion. And the Vanyar are the ones who go to Valinor and they stay there. They don't come back to Middle-earth. Then we have the Noldor. The Noldor are the ones who are going to go to Valinor. They're going to make it there, and then they're going to come back. And that's one of the huge plot points in the entire Silmarillion. So the Noldor, you want to pay attention to them. They're really important to the whole story. And lastly, we have the Teleri. The Teleri are the sea elves. So anytime that we're talking about boats or something like that, there's a good chance that we're talking about the Teleri. And the Teleri are an interesting group because they're where a lot of these other words come in that we're not going into today, because they get broken up into subgroups, because only some of them, really not that many at all, make it to Valinor, and a lot of them end up not making it. So there's all these different subgroups, but it's really just important to understand that the Teleri are kind of the 3rd group of elves here that set out on the journey, and some of them made it and some of them didn't. Now, that's really an oversimplification, and there'll probably be people who come and roast me in the comments for simplifying it that way, but I just want you to be able to get through this chapter and have enough of a grasp of what's going on so that you can continue in and get into the meat of the story. That's enough vocabulary for now. There's a lot more vocabulary words that we could go into in this chapter, but we're not going to. Next, let's talk about the major characters. First off, we've talked about the Valar already a lot in every episode of this Silmarillion Summarized, but just to review, let's just hit on some of the major players that are going to be in this chapter. Again, some of the Valar show up only in the Valaquenta and really never again. But there are some major players that we want to talk about here. And it's almost all of the major players that make some appearance in this chapter, so let's just review them, especially since it's been a while. First off, we're going to have Yavanna. Yavanna is basically the Vala of flora and fauna, the animals and the plants. And you know her as being associated with Ents, and she made the trees, so she's kind of a big deal. So she'll be there at the beginning of this chapter, and then she'll kind of fade out. Then we have Manwë, and Manwë is the king, basically, of all the earth. He is the Vala in charge, and he's one that you want to pay attention to. Whenever he's doing something, it's really important. He is associated with air. Then we have Ulmo. Ulmo is like buds with Manwë, and he's the Vala who's associated with water. So all oceans, rivers, streams, lakes, all of that stuff falls under Ulmo. And he's going to be really important in the story as we progress, but he'll only play a small role in this chapter. Then there's Varda. Varda is the wife of Manwë, and she is the one who's associated with starlight. And so she's going to be really important in this chapter because the stars are a major part of the elves waking up. Also, she has a ton of names. The elves just couldn't stop naming things. Treebeard, of course, talks about that in The Lord of the Rings. And they have a ton of names for Varda. So don't worry about trying to keep it all straight. When it's important, they'll probably call her Varda. Okay, then we have Tulkas. Tulkas is kind of like the big kid of the Valar, and he's also their best fighter. So when they go to war against Melkor, Tulkas becomes really important. But other than that, he doesn't play any major roles in the story. Then there's Aule. Aule, of course, is the smith, and we talked about him a lot in the last episode in this series because he made the dwarves. And so he is very concerned with earth and crafting and creativity. And then we have Mandos. Mandos is the doomsayer of the Valar. And it gets confusing because his name and the place where he lives are both called Mandos, because he basically adopts the name of the place where he lives. You can kind of think of him as the Vala of the Dead, because beings go to the halls of Mandos after they die. He doesn't come up a lot, but when he does, it's almost always because he has something important to say. So if Mandos is talking, pay attention. It's probably a big deal. And those are your major Valar in this one, except for one that I've saved, and that is Orome. Orome is going to play the biggest role in this chapter 3 because he is the one who's going to find the elves. He is the huntsman of the Valar, and he rides a horse. And that brings us to another one of the characters for this chapter, and that is Nahar. Now, my pronunciation is probably off with that, and probably off with a lot of things. It's hard to pronounce Tolkien words, so don't roast me over that. But his horse Nahar. Knowing the horse's name is not really important, except that it comes up several times in this chapter, and it can throw you off if you don't understand who they're talking about. So just know it's Orome's horse. All right, then we have someone who used to be a Valar, who's not now, and that is Melkor. Melkor's the big bad. Whenever you see Melkor, he will also be called Morgoth, but not in this chapter. Just know he's the big bad guy, the satanic figure. He's causing all the trouble. And speaking of causing trouble, we have another character who comes in here, and that is Sauron. Now, Sauron you know from The Lord of the Rings, but here he is Melkor's lieutenant. And like I said earlier, he's stationed out in Angband, watching over kind of that summer home on the coast. He's not going to play a huge role in this chapter, except that he will disappear and they won't know where he is. The other major characters that aren't these supernatural ones that I want to introduce you to are 3 of the elves. There's going to be 3 important elves here, and really 2 of them are a lot more important than the other one. But these are associated with those 3 groups of elves that I talked about before. So first we have Ingwe. Now Ingwe is going to be the leader of the Vanyar, meaning they're going to go over to Aman and they're not coming back to Middle-earth. So we have Ingwe. He's like a big deal in Elvendom, but also he never does anything in the story, so you don't really have to worry about him. Then we have Finwë. Now Finwë is over the Noldor, and the Noldor, particularly Finwë's children and their children, but all of the Noldor are going to play a big role in the story. And then we have Elwë. And Elwë, who is also called Thingol later on, it's going to get a little bit confusing, but right now he's called Elwë. He himself is going to play a big role, and he is over the Teleri, and the Teleri are going to play a pretty important role. So those are the 3 elves, and they're going to be important in the story because they're the elves who go to Valinor and then come back and convince all the other elves to come. Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë. Elwë also has a brother, Olwë, who will play a little bit of a role in this chapter and will play a larger role in the Teleri's travels later. All right, now that we know a little bit about the characters that are going on in this chapter, just understand that this is not a narrative-heavy chapter, so you don't see a ton from the characters. It's more broad historical stuff here. So let's talk about those things. Let's talk about the major events that happen. So first off, we have Melkor, and he's gathering strength to himself in Utomo. Basically, he's bringing in the Balrogs and all other kinds of evil creatures and stuff. Now, no orcs yet, but lots of other evil creatures, maybe some of those nameless things, I don't know, but he's bringing them together in Utomno, and he's also establishing Angband with Sauron. Then, the next major event is the Valar hold a council. Now they do this a lot. They kind of get together and they chat about things and they try and decide what they're going to do and how much effort they're going to put into Middle-earth versus not. This happens from time to time. And at this point, they decide that they're not going to attack Melkor because they don't know where the children of Iluvatar are. That's the elves and the men. But right now, we're really thinking about the elves who will come first. They don't know where they are and they don't want to destroy everything and perhaps destroy the elves in the process. But they do know that the elves are going to need the stars. And the stars right now, not so bright. So Varda, remember her, she's the one the elves really like. She decides she is going to make new and brighter and better stars. And there's another whole vocabulary section that you could have just on the stars, but it's not important for you to memorize that or even to know what the different stars are called, really. The one that is kind of interesting is the Sickle of the Valar is a constellation that she makes, and that's the Big Dipper. So if you're ever looking at the Big Dipper and you're like, man, I wish that had a cooler name, just call it the Sickle of the Valar. So after these stars are made, it's actually pretty soon that the elves awake. Now the Valar don't know that the elves have awoken, but the elves awake. Remember in Cuvianen, the elves awake, and they're there for some amount of time. What happens here is a little bit confusing with the way it's structured in the chapter, but basically what happens is either Melkor shows up or Melkor sends some servants to show up. Melkor, knowing that Orome is going to come riding in on his horse, remember that, he sends either servants or himself looking like a man on a horse and scaring the elves, basically, so that they will be scared of Orome when he comes. And some elves just disappear. Now that's important to know because these elves who disappeared are probably going to become the progenitors of the orcs later on. They're going to be tortured by Melkor and become the progenitors of the orcs. So you've got that going on. And then your next big event is Orome actually showing up. And the elves are like, whoa, hey dude, we don't know what to do with you because we're scared of the guy on the horse because we've heard stories about elves disappearing. Orome, of course, eventually is able to get them to understand who he is, but there's this little bit of hesitation and already these seeds of deception that Melkor had sown immediately upon the elves' entrance into Middle-earth. So Orome goes back, he talks to the Valar, and Manwë decides to summon the Valar again for another council in the Ring of Doom. And they council together and they say, well, now that the elves are out, we know where they are, we can protect them, we need to take down Melkor. And so they do. They send their forces, and there isn't a lot of detail on this battle, and specifically the reason we don't have it is the Silmarillion is an elf story. The elves are telling the story, and they don't know a lot about what happens in this battle, where the Valar are going out, they're taking down Melkor. What we do know is just basically some hints and stuff, but it was a big fight, and Tulkas basically pushes Melkor all the way into the furthest part of Utumno, and he wrestles him to the ground. And then Ale has this chain that he's made, and they chain him up. So that's great. Melkor is basically out of the picture. The next thing that happens is they take him to Aman, and he has to stand judgment. And they say that he's not going to be released for 3 ages. What 3 ages actually means? It's a little bit confusing, but basically Melkor's going to be wrapped up in chains for a long time, and that gives the Valar some time to work with the elves. But Melkor has put so much that's evil into the world that the Valar are really concerned about the elves. And so as they're holding council, they decide that what they should do is bring the elves from Middle-earth to Valinor. And the one who they send to do this is, of course, Orome, because he has the best relationship with the elves. The other ones, they haven't really seen except some scary stuff with the little bit that they saw during the war. And so they send Orome to kind of smooth things over with the elves and tell them, hey, you should all come with us. And the elves, they don't really want to. They're like kind of scared of the Valar because all they kind of know about them is this destructive, wrathful piece. And so Orome takes the 3 elves, Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë, and he takes them to Valinor, lets them see the light of the trees, and then the next major event is he brings them back, and they say, hey everyone, the trees are awesome. We should all go to Valinor. Now, not everyone decides to go to Valinor, but this is the next big event. This is the Great Journey, where the elves make this huge migration, and it's going to take a long time for them to get there. Some of them move faster, like the Vanyar. Some of them move slower, like the Teleri. Some of them make it. Some of them never make it at all. But we're not to that point in the story yet. It's just kind of hinted at in the way that the groups of elves are named, but we're going to get more detail on that later on. So this is sometimes called the Great March, and it's the elves as they move. And of course they have to cross the land, they have to get over mountains. There's going to be a lot that goes on with that, but that's basically where the story leaves off, is the elves engaged in the Great March when we get to the end of chapter 3. And that brings us basically to the end of this video. We have the elves, they're moving, and now we just need to talk about the major themes. And because this chapter is so historical, there's so much less narrative to it, I wouldn't say that there are a lot of major themes. There aren't a lot of themes introduced, and there isn't a lot of pickup on the old themes that we've been following. We have a little bit about sub-creative acts with Melkor and the orcs, basically saying that Melkor can't create something new, he can only twist something that's already been made, and that is his most evil work. So some of that creative stuff that we've been tracking as different members of the Valar have engaged in sub-creation, we kind of pick up on a little bit of that there, and Melkor's stuff with the orcs is really bad. But other than that, not a whole lot. We still see the music in motion. We know that Iluvatar's plan will not be foiled by Melkor, and we see the Valar going to work. But with the Valar going to work, we do get one new theme. What seems good is not always good, and what seems evil is not always evil. And this gets really complicated, but the Valar, for as much as they seem like gods, they make mistakes. And one of their biggest mistakes, and it's pointed out in this chapter, is asking the elves to migrate over to Aman. They're doing it for a good reason. They want to protect them. They want them to enjoy the light of the trees. But it's not really the role that Iluvatar set for the elves, for them to leave Middle-earth and be apart from it. And so it's going to cause trouble. In fact, the whole book is basically going to be trouble that is brought about as a result of this. Now, lots of different elves are going to make choices that contribute to this, particularly a guy named Feanor, who we haven't gotten to yet. But it starts kind of here with the Valar deciding that they're going to do something good and it not quite working out. Why is this important? Well, It's important because when you get to the stage of the Lord of the Rings that most of us are familiar with, the Valar are not super present in that story. In fact, almost none of them get named, and they very rarely get referenced to, except to be like, well, they don't seem to be doing anything. This is in the Council of Elrond where they're talking about taking the ring west. And this is why. The Valar made some mistakes, which caused some problems. And so it's not that they're hands off during the Lord of the Rings, but it's that they take a much different approach than they were taking in the Silmarillion. How do these good choices that the Valar or the Elves seem to be making end up impacting the people in the story? What actually happens with them? So that is the one major theme from this chapter that is kind of introduced that we'll want to track throughout. Okay, that's going to do it for us today. Now, this chapter is heavy, like I said, so if you need to skip it, don't worry. Just kind of rely on this summary to get through it and get on to the next chapter, which is really short. But now I would love to hear from you. What do you think of chapter 3 if you've read it? What confuses you about it? And what important points do you think there are in it that people need to know if they're going to be reading the Silmarillion? And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.